Now, what is the evidence base for antipsychotics? It consists of two parts. So if you go to the New England Journal of Medicine and you have people review it, it has two parts. One is, if you take people who go into a hospital with an acute psychotic episode, and you treat half of them with an antipsychotic, and half of them with placebo, at the end of 6 weeks, at least on their scales, they will say that psychotic symptoms have abated more in the drug-treated group. And in terms of how much, that's a bit of a debate, but generally that's what shows up on their scales, that the drugs knock down psychotic symptoms better than placebo over the short term. And that's why the drugs of this sort get approved by the FDA. You have that short-term efficacy, and that's how you get on the market. So now once that happens, and the first such study was done in the early 1960s. Now once that happens, they have to ask themselves, well, how long should patients stay on the drugs? And they ran a number of studies, like the Psychiatric Research Establishment, designed like this. They would take people who had stabilized well on antipsychotics, and often at the end of 1 year, the good responders, because many people don't stabilize well, but they would take the good responders, meaning people with an absence of psychotic symptoms, and they would divide them into two groups. Half would be maintained on the medication, the other half would be abruptly withdrawn. And virtually most of the trial designs were abrupt withdrawal. And now what they found is that those abruptly taken off the medication relapsed. In other words, the psychotic symptoms came back at a much greater rate than those maintained on the medications. So what physicians saw that, the researchers said, look at what happens when we withdraw the medication. The disease returns, they said. Therefore, keeping people on medications prevents the return of the disease. They prevent relapse. And that became the rationale for keeping people on medications long-term. That, antipsychotic medications, that type of study. Now, what is missing from the literature are many gradual withdrawal studies. Here we are in 2010. I don't really know of a well-designed gradual study. Now, there have been some sort of gradually designed studies, and when people looked at that, this was done in 1997 by Ross Baldassarrini, looking at the relapse rate for people who gradually withdrawn from medications. He found it wasn't much higher than those maintained on the medications. In fact, it was pretty much the same. That was one thing he found. And then he found something else. He said in those studies, if you could get people after 6 months, and there was a pretty high relapse rate in the first 6 months, but he said if people could get beyond the 6 months, then they had an excellent chance of remaining well indefinitely. And it looked like more than 50%, or around 50% in those gradual withdrawal studies. Remaining well indefinitely. Now that starts to give us a story that is different than the drugs for life story that we hear all the time. Real quickly, in order to piece together the long-term outcomes picture for medications and how these drugs affect the long-term outcomes, we need to have a sense of what is the natural course of schizophrenia? What's the natural course of outcomes? So what I did is I looked for outcomes of first episode schizophrenia patients from 1945 to 1955 and looked at their discharge rates and also how were they doing 5 years later. And here's what you find in those studies. I won't go through them individually. You find that roughly 70% of first episode patients in that 75, from 1975, 45 to 55, would be discharged within 12 to 18 months. And at the end of 5 years, somewhere between 70 and 75% would be living out in the community successfully, not on disability. And employment rates would be above 50% for that group of patients. Okay, so this is a very different vision of schizophrenia that we hear about. Because what we hear about is that prior to Thorazine, people with schizophrenia were on the back wards and they couldn't live in the community, right? That's what we hear about, and the drugs made that possible. What that back ward community is that 30% that didn't get well. That's the chronic group of it. We're forgetting about all these people that got discharged and were living in the community. All right, that becomes sort of a baseline. That, by the way, I would say is a very optimistic thing. More than half worked, 70% living independently in the community. If we could do that today, I'm telling you, we would be thrilled. And imagine this, if you take a person, just a matter of why I believe this is optimistic. Imagine now you have an 18-year-old kid that has, quote, a psychotic episode, maybe, and ends up in the hospital. You don't have to tell that kid, listen, you have a broken brain, you're going to be on drugs for life. You have to say, well, listen, there's every reason to believe we can get you back in the community, you can go back to work, that sort of thing. It's a much more optimistic, hopeful message. Okay, the long-term outcomes literature for antipsychotics. I just mentioned the first short-term study done by the NIH was done in the early 1960s. It had 4 arms of the study. It had 3 drug-treated groups. It had 1 placebo group. Again, at the end of 6 weeks, the drug-treated groups were doing better. That study is still cited. At the end of 1 year, however, there was an odd finding. It was the drug-treated people that were more likely to be re-hospitalized at the end of 1 year than the placebo group. So right at this very beginning moment in the outcomes literature, we see the barest hint of a paradox. Short-term efficacy, but is there a possibility that it's increasing long-term chronicity? It shows up at this very first moment. Now, over the next few years, researchers said, yeah, we're getting the whole revolving door syndrome starts coming into practice. We're getting these patients out of the hospital, but they're coming right back. So we had this sense that people actually are relapsing more frequently than they used to be. And then researchers also doctors made this comment. They said, it also seems that relapse on medication, if that happens, is more severe than if you've never been exposed to the medication. It seems like for whatever reason, either as they come off or while they're on the medication, we're seeing more severe relapses than we used to see. Now, in the early 1975, a man named Samuel Bachhoven at Boston Psychopathic Hospital said, wow, I'm going to go back and do a retrospective study. I'm going to look at my outcomes for my patients in 1947, my 5-year outcomes, psychotic patients, and I'm going to compare them to my 5-year outcomes of my patients treated with drugs in 1967. And what he found is a couple of things. He found in 1947, only that 45% of his patients treated in 1947 with sort of psychosocial care, 45% never relapsed after they were discharged in the next 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, 76% were living in the community independently, in essence. They're not on disability. Among his drug-treated patients in 1967, only 31%, a lower number, were discharged and didn't relapse in the next 5 years. And he noted that they were much more dependent, much more socially dependent than they had been in 1947. So here's what he writes in his findings. Rather unexpectedly, these data suggest that psychotropic drugs may not be indispensable. Their extended use in aftercare may prolong the social dependency of many discharged patients. Okay, that's one voice looking at the comparison between 47 to 67. Now, because of all this, the NIMH now, in the 1970s, funds 3 new studies with a longer look at conventional care, okay, with neuroleptics. And these studies run from 1 to 3 years. They're the only such studies we really have. And we're going to compare that to a type of care in one study that involves this. It involves intensive psychosocial care, or basically intensive residential care. And we're going to use the drugs in this way. We're not going to immediately put people on neuroleptics, but if they don't get better in 4 or 5 weeks, then we'll put them on drugs. So it's sort of selective use. And then the other studies one was done at the University of California, also provided a lot of psychosocial care that basically had the same design with the use of drugs. We'll have one group randomized, and these were first episode studies. One group immediately randomized to drugs, the other one will reserve use of neuroleptics. Okay? So sort of a selective use model. And there was a third study done in-house at the NIMH. Here were the results. At the University of California study, there's a couple findings. They had 41 patients treated in the hospital in the experimental arm without drugs initially. At the end of 3 years, 24 of the 41, whatever percentage that is, had never been exposed to a single dose of antipsychotic medication. So more than half. And it was that group of patients, of all the patients in the study, that had by far the best outcomes. So what he saw at that time, there was at least a subgroup of people that descended into psychosis that could get better without antipsychotics, and if you didn't put them on antipsychotics, they tended to have really good long-term outcomes, 3-year outcomes. Now, the other groups that were treated anyway, that's the one finding. The second finding is, as a group, so you had experimental care where you delayed use of medication versus standard care, overall outcomes were better with this selective model of care. Okay, this was a better way to use medications. Here's what he writes.